Hey guys, welcome back and thank you for tuning in. This week I want to talk about God's existence and precision being evident in nature. The Bible asserts that the universe is a testimony to God's existence and precision. The psalmist said, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard." And in Romans, Paul said, "For since the creation of the world, his attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Yet the naturalists try to excuse them away." You can clearly see his precision in hand in a fine-tuned universe, which I understand there are several objectors to that theory, and only one has any traction, is maybe multiverse theory, but that's a religion within itself. I'll save that for another segment. I'll get into that, but I want to stay, go with the origin of the species or the origin of life, abiogenesis, as it pertains to the precise and invisible elements of a creator. But first, I have a question of: why does every field of study, biology, cosmology, geology, the fields of physics, point back to a creator? Like, you would think at least one of those fields would be absolute and have adequate evidence that the creator does not exist. And the deeper we dive into each of these fields, the more questions arise rather than answers. And it works out great for me because I can argue the God of the gaps with a counter that science actually widens the gaps when it should be narrowing them. And speaking on God of the gaps, Newton didn't renounce God upon the discovery of gravitational theory or his gravitational law. He marveled at the way God laid it out so perfectly and mathematically. And Kepler, who figured out that the planets orbit on the ellipsis, said it was so wonderful that God had revealed the way things worked, and that we could describe them in a language of mathematics, and then talked about thinking God's thoughts after him. This all increased their belief in God. It's by what they understood, not by what they didn't understand. So when we talk about the God of the gaps, I like to think that it's really, science of the gaps, or gaps increased by science. When you look at abiogenesis and you go back to the Miller-Urey Nobel Prize experiment, all it did was increase the number of questions. It didn't narrow the gap or disprove God. It increased our questions. The list got exponentially larger, especially when we discovered the digital nature of life in the DNA. But God is not a place filler for me. The science that I do understand points me to a God, not the science that I don't. So, for instance, if I talk about abiogenesis here as a case for the creator, well, problem number one is that there's no viable mechanism to generate the primordial soup that we supposedly formed in. Problem number two is forming polymers requires a dehydration synthesis and temperature control and amongst other things for it to take place. Problem number three, they try to bring in RNA world hypothesis, but that lacks confirming evidence. And I'll get into those evidences in this segment. Problem number four is unguided chemical processes cannot explain the origin of the genetic code. It's just not there. And problem number five is there's no workable model for the origin of life has ever been produced, ever. Never been done. So it's funny, the latest accepted science published in Nature, the highest, most respected scientific journal in all the world. I mean, it's up there with the journal of American Medicine or the American Science Journal. I mean, it's the highest accepted journal in science and the natural sciences, and the latest answer or explanation that they have was written and submitted by Nobel laureate Dr. Jack Stoczak in November of 2018. That's very recent. And I'm going to get real long-winded here in the science of it, but I think that it's important. And he writes that, maybe I can summarize it. The early atmosphere had no oxygen. It only consisted mainly of nitrogen and carbon dioxide with small amounts of hydrogen, water, and methane. 2, lightning and asteroid impacts and UV light from the sun acted on the atmosphere to generate hydrogen cyanide, a compound of hydrogen and carbon and nitrogen. 3, it rained into the volcanic crater lakes, and the cyanide reacted with the iron brought up by the water circulating through the rocks. 4, the resulting iron cyanide compounds accumulated over time, building up into a concentrated stew of reactive chemicals. Then 5, he says, life as we know it requires RNA. And this is where it starts getting speculative. Some scientists believe that RNA emerged directly from these reactive chemicals, nudged along by dynamic forces in the environment. This is in a scientific journal, that they were nudged along by dynamic forces in the environment. What does that mean? What journal have you ever read, or have you ever presented articles to a journal that are you allowed to write nudged along without explaining the chemistry, and then dynamic forces in the environment? What dynamic forces, and what does nudged mean? Okay. So 6, nucleotides, the building blocks of RNA, eventually formed, then joined together to make strands of RNA. Some stages in this process are still not well understood. Some stages in this process are still not well understood. All the stages in this process are not understood, but that's okay. I guess in science, you're just allowed to be intellectually dishonest and just put conjecture as facts, and it's okay. 7, once the RNA was made, some strands of it became enclosed within tiny vesicles formed by spontaneous assembly of fatty acids, the lipids, into membranes, creating the first protocells. And 8, as the membranes incorporated more fatty acids, they grew and divided at the same time. Internal reactions drove replication of the encapsulated RNA. That's total nonsense. How? Where's the chemistry? Show me the chemistry. Where are the enzymes in prebiotic earth for bonding? It isn't there. Nobody has ever built a living cell. No one. And that's under with sterile glass tubes and the purest forms of chemicals that you can buy with a guided hand, and they still can't do it. And they want us to believe that this all just happened randomly, unguided, under a rock. So why is this bad when they allow stuff to be published like this? Like, professors see this and say, "Oh, look, they figured it out. It's complete." They did it. They did the experiments. Put that in the books, and we'll teach it. But it's a complete fabrication. It's a lie. Every chemist knows that molecules do not seek life ever. In a lab, in nature, never. They don't care about life. Only organisms care about life. Chemistry, on the contrary, is utterly indifferent to life. Without a biological derived entity acting upon them, molecules have never been shown to evolve towards life. Never. Molecules have no brain. There has never been a molecule that moves towards non-regular assembly. But non-ordered assembly, which is a non-regular pattern, it's what you have in DNA. You have to have non-regular patterns in order to have complexity for living systems. In order for this to happen, there has to be some type of entity to act upon them in order to attain a non-regular pattern. Even now, we know this, even with humans manipulating the molecules in a controlled environment, we still cannot produce life. 66 years of study in the origin of life field has not moved 1 inch since 1952. Think about that. Think about all the things that have happened in 66 years in science. But in this field, they can't move past, not even forward an inch in 66 years. Anyways, the article surprising. I mean, it is really surprising to me, but it ended up being such an embarrassment that it had to be retracted. And as always, the retraction is teeny tiny so no one sees it. But Stozak himself said, in retrospect, we were totally blinded by our belief in our findings. We were not as careful or rigorous as we should have been in interpreting these experiments. That's what you have to say. So this is the highest Nobel Prize winner, highest scientist in all the land, has no idea how this happens, but yet they're out there teaching this, and evolutionary theory is in the origin of life is fact, and it's pure conjecture. So I just want you guys to know that. You don't believe me, Google it. Go ahead. It's like these are called, these are protocell experiments. Have you ever heard of a proto-turkey? So this is the equivalent to every protocell experiment that's ever been performed. You take 20 pounds of sliced turkey, you add a gallon of turkey broth, warm it, stick a few feathers in it, and then suggest that a live turkey will eventually come gobbling out of it if you add enough time. Or a proto-turkey or extant turkey has been synthesized. Now, even with all of that said about the matter, not the matter, but the physical matter, the information, the DNA or RNA, is primary and the matter is secondary. So the scientist can't even get the matter right, the carbohydrates, the nucleic acids, lipids, and proteins, let alone the information, the actual code that tells us what the cells, tells the cells what to build. So, and it's just scary to me because this kind of scientific culture actually discourages, new ideas. Science brought me back to God. One of my favorite quotes, at least attributed to Werner Heisenberg, one of the fathers of quantum physics, is that the first gulp of the glass of the natural sciences will turn you into an atheist, but at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. Now, I know that someone quoted him in a class lecture saying that the internet says that they could never attribute that to Heisenberg because he never wrote it down, but there are still other sources that of scientists that said similar things. Francis Bacon said of atheism, "A little philosophy inclineth man's minds to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth men's minds about to religion." And again, Alexander Pope wrote an essay in 1709, "A little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep, or taste not the perennial spring. Their shallow draughts intoxicate the brain, and drinking largely sobers us again." So, I'm sorry for running long on this one, guys. There's just a lot of information to cover, but, everyone accuses apologists and Christians of being, intellectually lazy. But true intellectual laziness is piggybacking off someone else's notes, and it happens in science and law and religion. Instead of researching and reading the sources yourself, you just go off what somebody else says and just assume that it's true because the professor said it or the rabbi said it or the minister said it, and then you go and perpetuate this false teaching. And that's what's happening in science right now. I mean, and Judaism, modern day Judaism, rabbis study the Tanakh, which is it's basically case law. It's opinions about the Torah from leading rabbis instead of just reading the Torah or the Bible yourself. And constitutional law, even at the Ivy League schools, they study the case law instead of the Constitution. In Christianity, they read the pastor's books instead of the Bible. In Catholicism, they quote the Vatican instead of the Bible. And in science, they're accepting their forefathers' discoveries as fact instead of looking at the actual data and the research. And there are real ramifications to this. There are dire ramifications. It really damages the natural sciences, and I love science. It fascinates me. It helps me understand the world around us. But when it's becoming its own religion, and that in itself is dangerous. Claims that mislead the public can affect funding. Uncorrected or unfounded assertions jeopardize beyond a singular field, especially when there's mounting distrust in higher education and the general public. Dismissive actions towards students or the public, if they don't accept conjectures as facts, it will lead to continued division. Scientists, professors, they have to tell the truth with specificity. Is it a fact or it isn't? And this is a big one for me. I've seen this firsthand. Is blackballing scientists if they bear a legitimate nonconformist view. They're being excluded from professional societies and academies, withholding funding, denying them tenure. This is anti-scientific behavior, and it will disrupt the advancement of science.